Okay, so today we're going to really get into something that I'm sure you've seen popping up all over the place online, and that's race swapping.
Yeah, it's everywhere. It's definitely a hot topic that brings up all sorts of questions about identity and culture and history, and people have pretty strong feelings about it.
For sure. It's pretty controversial.
Yeah.
So to really get a handle on this whole race swapping thing, we've gathered a whole bunch of interesting stuff. We've got these YouTube videos where people are talking about transracialism, which is, the idea of changing your race.
Right.
And then there's some videos about the history of racism in science, which I think helps us understand, how we even got to this point where we're talking about race in these ways.
Exactly. Because to understand where we are, you have to look back and see, how these ideas about race were formed.
Totally. And then there's some personal stories too about how people deal with race in their own lives, which I think is super important to hear.
Definitely. Those personal experiences give us a real sense of what this all means on a human level.
It's not just an abstract concept. And then we got some deep dives into Wikipedia, looking up stuff about ethnicity and race and even things like genome editing, which is, well, we'll get into that.
We'll get there.
And then we also went into the world of Reddit.
Oh, Reddit.
There's this whole community for people who call themselves diaracials, and we'll unpack what that means.
It's a fascinating corner of the internet.
For sure. And to top it all off, we have an academic paper that gets into the nitty-gritty of transracial identity, trying to make sense of it. And another one that compares it to transgender identity, which I think is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, that comparison really throws the whole debate into sharp relief.
So that's kind of what we're working with here. A lot of different perspectives, a lot of different sources. Our goal, though, isn't to pick sides or anything. We just want to break it all down and help you understand why people are talking about race swapping so much these days.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the nuances, the arguments, and the different perspectives at play.
Right. So I think the first thing we need to tackle is this whole idea of what race even is. It seems pretty straightforward, but when you start digging into it, it gets kind of complicated.
Yeah, it gets murky fast. One of the really interesting things that came up in all these sources is this tension between seeing race as a social construct and seeing it as something rooted in biology.
Is it something we made up or is it in our genes?
Exactly. And historically, that biological view was super influential. I mean, you see it all over the history of racism and science videos. They show how race was used to create these really rigid hierarchies, to justify things like colonialism and slavery.
Yeah, that's a really dark part of history. The video talked about polygenism, which is the idea that different races came from different origins.
Right. It's like saying different races are different species, which is completely bogus, but people used it to justify some truly awful things.
And then there's Carl Linnaeus, who came up with these racial classifications in the 1700s, and some of the stuff he wrote is just so offensive.
It really highlights how entrenched these racist ideas were in science for a long time.
And it's crazy how those early ideas still have an impact on us today, even though we know better.
They definitely cast a long shadow, even as our understanding of race has evolved. In the 20th century, there was a big shift in how we think about ethnicity. We moved away from this primordialist view, which is the idea that ethnicity is this fixed, ancient thing.
It's been the same forever.
Yeah, exactly. But now we tend to have a more constructivist perspective, which sees ethnicity as something shaped by social forces and culture. It's constantly changing and evolving.
So it's not just about where your ancestors came from, but about how you live your life and how society sees you.
Exactly. It's about shared experiences and cultural practices.
Even when we look at physical evidence, trying to figure out someone's race from their skeleton, the Wikipedia entry on race was pretty clear that we're still just imposing our own social categories.
No.
It's not like there's some objective biological race hidden in our bones.
Right. And it's not just bones. Even when you look at genetics, there's this thing called the K5 partition, which basically shows that there are some genetic clusters that roughly align with our ideas of racial groups.
So there is some genetic basis for race.
To a very limited extent, but the big takeaway here is that humans are incredibly similar genetically. We share 99.9% of our DNA. So the differences we see, they don't really fit neatly into these racial boxes.
It's more like a spectrum than these clear-cut categories.
Exactly. So while genetics plays a tiny role, The reality is that race as we experience it, how it impacts our lives, that's all about social meaning and how society treats us based on how we look.
It's more about how we see each other than about actual biological differences. Okay, so if we're on the same page that race is mostly a social construct, then this whole idea of transracialism gets really interesting. Like, can you actually change your race if it's not really this fixed biological thing?
That's the million-dollar question, and the answer, at least from society's perspective, seems to be a pretty firm no. I mean, you see it in all those YouTube videos, the huge backlash against people who claim to be transracial.
Yeah, like Rachel Dolezal and Shea King, they both got a ton of criticism when it came out that they were presenting themselves as black, even though they had white ancestry.
Exactly. And it's interesting because we're seeing more and more acceptance of transgender people, right? Like, people are starting to understand that gender identity isn't always the same as the sex you're assigned at birth.
But when it comes to race, it seems like there's this idea that you're stuck with what you're born with, no matter how you feel.
And one of the big arguments for why that is this idea that racial oppression is intergenerational. Like, the impacts of racism are passed down through generations, creating this whole legacy of injustice that's tied to ancestry.
The example they used in one of the YouTube videos was the Canadian Indigenous residential schools. It was this horrific system where they took Indigenous kids away from their families and tried to erase their culture.
And the trauma from that is still felt today. It's not just about individual experiences, it's about this historical and systemic oppression that's connected to being Indigenous.
So the argument is that you can't just choose to be Indigenous because it's not just a feeling, it's about this whole history of suffering and resilience.
Right. And that's where the comparison between transracial and transgender falls apart for a lot of people. They say it's not the same thing because race is so deeply intertwined with this history of oppression.
But even though society might be pretty clear on this no changing your race thing, there's a whole world online where people are exploring these ideas,
Yeah.
and it's pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you've got the diaracial community on Reddit and subreddits like Are Transracial and Ras Transrace, and then there's TikTok and Discord. There are people all over the internet who identify as transracial and are finding ways to connect with each other.
It's like they're creating their own spaces to figure this all out, even if the rest of the world isn't quite ready for it.
Exactly. And their motivations are really diverse. You have people like that person on Reddit who talked about their deep connection to Japanese culture, even though they don't have any Japanese ancestry.
Right. They talked about feeling more comfortable when they wear Japanese-style makeup and how they even get mistaken for being East Asian sometimes.
It's like they feel this strong pull toward another culture, like it resonates with them on a really personal level.
And then there's this academic questionnaire we found that's trying to understand the transracial community better.
Hmm.
It's clear that people are putting a lot of thought into this and trying to figure out what it means to them.
Right. It's not just some frivolous thing. There are genuine feelings and experiences behind it.
But then you have cases like Oli London, which it kind of throw a wrench in everything. They had all this plastic surgery to look Korean, and it caused a lot of controversy.
Yeah, people accuse them of being disrespectful and just doing it for attention.
It felt like they were reducing Korean culture to a bunch of stereotypes. And it brings up this whole question of cultural appropriation, which is a huge part of the debate.
Exactly. Like, where's the line between appreciating another culture and just taking whatever you want without really understanding it?
And there's also the question of face claiming, where people in online spaces identify as a certain race based on how they look, even if they haven't had any surgeries or anything.
It's interesting because it highlights how much of this is about appearance, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, what happens when technology catches up? What if we could actually change our physical features more drastically?
That's where things could get really wild. The Wikipedia article on genome editing talks about some pretty advanced tech, like Talon and Mage, which can actually change your DNA.
But it's important to note that none of the sources suggested that this technology is being used to change people's race right now. It's mostly being used for other stuff, like medical research.
Right, but it does make you think, like, what if we could literally edit our genes to look like a different race? Would that change the conversation about transracialism?
It's a thought-provoking idea, for sure. But right now, it's more science fiction than reality.
Okay, so let's get into some of the actual arguments for and against transracialism. The academic paper we read brought up this interesting concept called the if Jenner then Dolezal argument.
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one. It basically draws a parallel between Caitlyn Jenner, who's transgender, and Rachel Dolezal, who claimed to be transracial.
And some people use this argument to say that if we accept transgender identity, then we should accept transracial identity too.
Like, if you can choose your gender, why not your race?
But then others used it to argue against both. They were like, if you think one is ridiculous, then the other one must be too.
It's a really loaded argument that can be used in a lot of different ways.
But beyond that specific argument, there's also this whole question of whether choosing a race is even possible in the same way that you can choose a gender identity.
Right. Like, some people argue that gender identity is more innate, more about who you are deep down.
Whereas race is seen as more tied to your ancestry and your culture, things you can't really change.
And then there's the issue of power dynamics, which is a huge part of this. The paper talked about how white to black transitions are often seen as an exercise of white privilege.
Like you get to try on being black without actually experiencing the real systemic discrimination that black people face.
Exactly, and that's a valid concern. But the paper also pointed out that you could make similar arguments about privilege in some transgender transitions, too. So it's a complex issue that goes beyond just transracialism.
It's about understanding power and how different identities are treated in society.
Absolutely.
Then there's this philosopher, Sally Haslanger, who has a really interesting perspective on race. She focuses on ancestry and how people are treated socially.
Right. So, according to her, if people believe you have black ancestry, even if you don't biologically, and they treat you as black, then you could be considered black under her definition.
So it's not just about your genes. It's about how society perceives you and how you're treated.
Exactly. Which is a really radical way of thinking about it.
And then some people go even further and say that we should just get rid of these fixed identity categories altogether.
They compare it to religion, like you're not born with a religion, you're socialized into it. So they argue that we should have a more fluid understanding of how people define themselves, including their race.
It's a really thought-provoking idea, but it's definitely controversial.
Oh, yeah. And you see a lot of pushback against transracialism, especially from Asian American communities.
They often feel like their experiences are being trivialized or mocked when people try to adopt their culture or appearance without really understanding what it means to be Asian American.
It's like someone who's insecure about their looks gets offended when someone less attractive claims to be a 10, you know?
It feels invalidating.
Exactly. And it highlights how complex these conversations about race and identity are.
And it's important to remember that this is all still pretty new. Like, the idea of transracialism is just starting to enter the mainstream conversation.
So there's a lot of confusion and resistance, which is understandable.
And unfortunately, sometimes it gets caught up in these broader culture war debates, which doesn't really help anyone understand the nuances.
It just makes it harder to have a productive conversation.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about cultural appropriation. It seems like that's one of the biggest concerns when it comes to race swapping.
Absolutely. When people adopt elements of another culture without understanding or respecting the meaning behind them, it can be really harmful.
Like wearing a Native American headdress as a fashion statement, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power dynamics at play and not just taking whatever you want from a culture that's been marginalized or oppressed.
And it's interesting because this desire to change your race can sometimes be connected to internalized racism, too.
Right. Like the idea that you need to look a certain way to be accepted or successful.
And the RCTA document we read, it talked about how people sometimes use cosmetic procedures to try and change their race, things like skin lightening or nose jobs.
It's a reflection of how deeply ingrained these beauty standards are in our society.
And then there's the case of Martina Big, who went to some pretty extreme lengths to appear black, and it caused a lot of debate.
Yeah, she got a lot of criticism for it, but she also has her supporters. It really forces you to think about, like, how far can you go with these physical changes?
And does it actually change your race in a meaningful way, or is it just surface level?
And then there's the whole history of passing, where people of color would try to pass as white to avoid discrimination.
So it's not like this is a new thing, this desire to change your racial appearance.
But the context is different now, and the power dynamics are really important to consider.
Okay, so last question. Can you actually change your race, like biologically? Is there some technology that can do that?
Well, the sources we looked at were pretty clear that current technology can't fundamentally change your race. You can have plastic surgery or skin treatments, but you can't change your bone structure or your genes in a way that would make you a different race.
So even with all the advancements we've made, there's still a limit to how much we can change our bodies.
Right. But it does bring up this interesting connection to the transgender experience. Susan Stryker, who's a transgender scholar, she talked about how people are using transgender narratives to try and understand transracialism.
Like they're seeing parallels between the two.
Exactly. But there's also this big distinction that keeps coming up, which is the perceived difference between sex and race.
Even though we know gender is socially constructed, sex is often seen as more biological, more fixed.
Whereas race, even though it's also a social construct, is still seen as more tied to your ancestry and your body.
So for a lot of people, changing your race feels a lot different than changing your gender.
Right. And the academic paper we read, it talked about these different ways of thinking about fluid racial identities, using the transgender experience as a kind of model.
They talked about trans of migration, which is like moving from one racial category to another. And then there's trans of between, where you identify with multiple races, and then trans of beyond, where you don't fit into any category at all.
It's like they're trying to create a language for understanding these more fluid experiences of race.
But even with all these different ways of thinking about it, there's still this tendency to see changing your sex or gender as more legitimate than changing your race.
And a lot of that comes down to how we perceive the body and how closely we link race to physical characteristics.
And then there's the social and political context, which is always important. The paper talked about how events like the killing of Michael Brown and the Charleston church shooting really highlighted the realities of racism.
Right. It reminded everyone that race is not just some abstract concept, it has real life or death consequences.
And that makes it harder to talk about race in this fluid, changeable way.
Exactly. It forces us to confront the very real harm that racism causes.
And there's also this interesting parallel with how we think about intersex conditions, which is when people are born with sex characteristics that don't fit into the typical male-female category.
Right. And we're starting to move away from these strict binary categories and recognize that sex is more of a spectrum.
Which kind of mirrors what's happening with race in a way.
Like, we're starting to question these rigid categories and think about identity in a more fluid, nuanced way.
But it's a slow process, and there's still a lot of resistance.
And even as we embrace more subjective views of identity, there's still this tendency to look for objective evidence to support them.
Like, people might feel a strong connection to another race, but then they'll try to find some ancestral link to legitimize it.
It's like we're still struggling to balance the personal and the social when it comes to identity.
So I think it's safe to say that this whole conversation about race swapping is just getting started.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that forces us to confront some really fundamental questions about how we understand ourselves and each other.
And while there's still a lot of disagreement and confusion, I think it's important to keep having these conversations.
Because the more we understand about race and identity, the better equipped we'll be to create a more just and equitable world.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
You're welcome. I think we both learned a lot today.
And for you listeners out there, keep thinking about these questions. How do you define race? What does it mean to you? And how do you think our understanding of race will continue to evolve in the future? Because this is a conversation that's going to continue, and it's going to shape how we live together in the years to come. So keep thinking, keep learning, and keep talking about it. Thanks for listening.